Lucia Cossu, voiceteacher here with a new episode of Voice series, and I wanted to go on with a practical analysis and explanation. Also said the tilt of the larynx, the context into the tilt of the larynx from a practical point of view. From a practical point of view, I have a new student, a classical student, who have a diagnosed hypermobility. Also said he has hyperflexible tissues. I would like to start with something that I'm in line with, and I hope very happy to be in line with. There it is, something that the excellent Craig Libenson says. When we change the word overused to underprepared, it signals you need to take more action. This leads to hopefulness. Why I say that? Because again, how do you take the factor and the characteristics of an hypermobile structure into the context of singing and of what we see into the singing, the training and what we find? He's not the first in my class and in my experience with such kind of structure. The others were not diagnosed, but the response of their system, of the behavior of their voices were quite similar, even of course not like him, because every individual then has quite profound differences from the others. Still, it is a bit of a continuum. And I'm very happy that I find myself into the strategies of Charlie Weingroff to the question. The general strategies also said what it means hypermobile. It means that usually the system gets to an access into the range of motion. What it implies, what it means for singing, for usual life, for how we find the system. It means that what other structures provide into the first parts, also said a more narrow segment around the natural of the range of motion, it is exactly what they do not find, because they target usually the movements at the end, at the extremes of the range of motion. This has consequences from the point of view of the adaptations in the muscles, in the tissues, into their activity, into the perceptions, and again into the system. When we get to understand that as Craig Libenson in this photo, in this post says, horizon, and in my experience, your entire voice and career. Underprepared. In the word underprepared is the solution. Underprepared means that if you have the tools to find what it is underprepared, or at least some parts which are underprepared, the tools to prepare those parts, you have an effective solution to what? To the underuse. To the overuse, sorry. Also said to all the consequences of what you find now your structure being, and the goals involved into the capacity of the structure to provide something. Why I tell you that? The third example that I made in my last episode, into the behavior of a structure, reactivity, etc., to me, she's into the continuum of the hypermobile. One important thing is that testosterone dominant biologies, also said bodies, provide and manifest themselves with more coactivation as the reactivity of the system in itself. Remember coactivation, what it was? It is the third law of Newton into the biological system, into the biomechanics. Also said we have a control of the movement by the opposite of the force provided. Also said into our system we have the agonist making the action, and the antagonist that let the action happen as first, and then by a mechanical transmission of the information into the brain, we have the regulation of the agonist action into the structure by the activation of the antagonist that becomes not a provider of the function but the regulatory action controlling the action by itself and the force, the action of the force into the system. Testosterone dominant structures have a more effective coactivation than estrogen progesterone dominant ones. Also said, estrogen and progesterone dominant structures manifest as more mobile, also said more hypermobile, than the testosterone dominant. And we know by history that women have never had a problem into voice, they just have different kind of characteristics, and we train differently if we are men or woman. And again, hormonally, it is not so clear. We have again gray zones. If you think underprepared, in what hypermobility has even less coactivation by itself in the spectrum of the mobility. And this is one thing. And again, we said women never had a problem into developing voices and having good voices compared to men. They're just different. Even if the instrument is the same, there are some specifics that make the planning and goal-oriented training slightly different. And then, so the structure becomes not overused, but characteristic. And the characteristics are our ingredients, creative ingredients. I said that because when we get to train hypermobile, we have to take into account that if you have less coactivation, you have to plan the work to have the same stimuli to the training and the same tissue adaptations that you want into a context in which you are going to provide what the less coactivated system does not provide yet by itself. And again, you see, I'm reasoning into preparing adequately what by itself the structure does not provide as a given, not as a problem, but just providing into the planning instead of thinking of an incapacity or inadequacy of the structure in itself. And again, not only we give hopefulness, we give results, horizon, career, voice, happiness. How it does work? You start controlling the training into obliged, narrower range of motion. Why that? Not only because the extremes of the range of motion is where you lack mobility as defined by Eric Cressy, that it is, and I repeat again, I will repeat in any episode nearly, it is the capacity of the system to enter the desired positions to the task that you require, but also it is the capacity of the system to exit the unrequired positions happening frequently into your task without damaging the structure. The end of the range of motion is where you start losing the capacity of exiting adequately the positions without damage. That's why the overuse. The narrowing of the range of motion, it has the logic that it is what the hypermobile structures do not usually maintain themselves. If they don't maintain themselves there intentionally, you're going to have an underprepared tissues, muscles, tendons, fascial, etc. But especially muscles. And one thing that perhaps you have not clear in the field of singing and voice production is that the muscles provide their function in a ratio that it is not dependent from neurological output or requirement, but it is position dependent directly. Also said from the studies of dorsal Andrews and the third, I will put again here on the hip muscles, it was clear that the ratio of action of a muscle was directly dependent, and also the function of the muscle that could be reverted, and we can make the case that it happens into the mobile segments, and larynx is a mobile structure, and we have thoracic, hips, mobile segments, and the cranial, that it is a mobile segment also, as I'm making the case. But I'm the first. You're not going to see that. I have serious reasons to make the case, and it is useful for the practice and for the singing. So, if into your range of motion you mostly inhabit the extremes, you're going not to find yourself all the ratio of functions of every single muscle of the joint or of the joints involved. Also said, you're going to find less skills and less functions into the movement, because they have trained just some segments at the end and not the neutral and the most central part. So the training into the neutral and the most central part is crucial, because it's going to prepare what, as a given, is usually underprepared. How we do that? Again, since it is a less coactivated structure, we are going to target slower movements, slower weight, and eventually some more repetitions, and then we use the speed and the slow to target the tissue adaptations that we want in the time. So we have precise patterns, and I have precise patterns to do that. And second thing, if you think of the vocal system as an isolated system by larynx by itself, respiratory system, and the other segments as provider of what? Just accessory things. You're doing the same thing of a player of basketball who is not able to jump and cannot use the jumping into his plane. Also said, you're having something that it is arm work to bring the ball into, which is going to have just one measure of the difference in 8. Also said, it becomes a fixed thing. And again, a fixed thing means less positions to do the task, because you have just the height of the player and of his shoulder, the length of his arm, and the fixed measure where you have to put the ball into. If you can jump, you can have many different ones. Many different ones means what? That your shoulder, your arm, can have different functions for the task. Also said, more options. More options mean more possibilities to get into, according to the context, according to what player you have in front, etc. Second point, you teach the structure to jump. You're teaching the segments and the muscles involved into the jumping to provide a kind of work that previously was not a given. This kind of work is the same involved into rotation, into extension. Also said, you provide to the same arm and shoulder and hand different kind of action even in the same relative position. Again, skills. Again, effectiveness. When I talk about the tilt of the larynx is into the context of the relative position of the larynx joints and into the absolute position and effectiveness of the larynx positions and of the segments, activating what? Providing some of the function for phonation which are not just into the larynx. You can call them accessory. I call them absolutely part of the vocal system. Let's get to the example of the classical singer. You have a less reactive system because you have less coactivation, and the coactivation is a function of the reactivity if you want. You have less developed neutral positions for the functions. Also said you're going to find some characteristic into the voice that usually has some lack of effective reactivity and nuances and force providing into the rhythm, into the tone, and in the passages of registers. How it happened in the past? With the third case that you hear, that you heard the last time and that I put back here, you're going to listen to what? To such kind or similar into my analysis of the structure that I had in front, plus she had something more than the student and others which were more mobile than usual students that I have, or usual structures if you prefer, it's more neutral, which it is that she declared to me to have a scar resulting on one fold, resulting from a surgery for a polyp that in one gig she developed. Yeah, it happens. It's an accident. Polyps are accidents, usually or very often. And the surgery was done immediately, so she had not-prepared phonation, but she told me that it resulted as a remaining of a scar. What you hear here, it is the overuse of what? As a consequence of underprepared segments and functions, and one from the structure that has tendency to be underprepared in some specific when you are more mobile. Second, of some segments that into her concept were not relevant for phonation, that I corrected, because yeah, they are relevant for phonation. What did we do? What did I do? I did the preparation, and since our cognitive capacity is huge and very sophisticated, I added the reactivity into an asymmetrical ratio by positions, etc., so that the system where she had this difference into the vibration into the vocal folds could give this from the functional segments, providing what into the vocal tract was not provided effectively there. into a slightly higher ratio, so that if you hear not anymore the overuse, and you hear not anymore the asymmetry. What it is, she declares, so I didn't see. So I cannot declare anything because I didn't see an image or something. But since I work on functionality and I work on voice production, you see that she has a career, she's perfect, she's not in overuse anymore. Why I say those kind of things? Because if you have in itself a structure that has less reactivity into the system and the tissues in itself, what we can do, we can provide so that less reactivity. This is your task. Or you force into the breath and the pressure to gain something, and you get to overuse. Or you find a way to provide the reactivity lacking into a way that it is organic to the task required. That it is what I do and what I teach and what I plan with the students if he is open to do this kind of path with me. What it is in clear words, it is less reactive. So we put what? Into the segments, especially into the mobiles one, and then we translate into the stable ones, what? The movements that provide and that translate into the vocal folds and into the singing with more rhythmic intention. As a provider, when you do that, you find yourself here. Also said, for your brain to the task, it doesn't matter anymore if you just provide one gesture and you find it here because you have coactivation, effective coactivation and some reactivity, or you provide many more gestures in a planned and organic way, so that those gestures I put into the musical style of the person or of the repertoire, and then it becomes a pattern of movement that is acquired forever, and it is intentional but not anymore intentionally activated as in the learning process, and you simply come back there, so that this hypermobility and those tissues just give their characteristic of sound, that it is the individual signature, and not only your hopefulness. You have this hope becoming reality, as with my students.